Okay, friends, we're at the beginning of the end, so we're going to have some exchange amongst the panelists. And then you're all part of the conversation, and there will be refreshments. So help us on the way. So I'll turn it over to the four of you. Michelle's going to go first.
Yeah, just thinking about what Greg and Brian shared. So much good there. I was just telling Greg, I think the Spotify spirituality that he brought up, I just said that's so true. And you know, and I think as I talk with the youth, you know, a lot of times they just share how, you know, their friends are just like searching for something deeper, but just don't really know, yeah, and not really finding it in any particular religion per se, but so I sense that there's this desire for them to connect, but they're kind of unsure of how to go about that, and yeah, so I think it helps maybe seeing the issue and, you know, trying to be able to speak into that. Yeah, and then, yeah, to what Brian brought up, yeah, I think that really hit me when you were saying technology, if I have it right, technology is like a practical issue, whereas science is a little more of the theoretical. And yeah, and I think that connected to one of the things that you brought up, Joshua, about you know, youth being just very connected to their technology and things like that. It's just, it's a very prevalent, like everyday part of their lives that I think it's really important that we address. Hard to know how exactly, but thank you.
I think I would offer just a thought about technology and tinkering. So when you were talking about Smith, the other researcher that I really related to in terms of emerging adults is Robert Withnow. And he has this idea of tinkering, which, or if you may fancy, bricoleur, creating bricolage. And that got me onto the Spotify spirituality idea. But I think that's what people do, and I think it's related to technology. So I think, Brian, there's a whole other section in my own things I've discovered that I think you're right, technology is really essential for getting this right. We really have to talk about science, technology, and faith. I don't think we can, I think technology and science are hard to distinguish these days. And they're not distinguishable by youth or by young adults. But they're related, this tinkering and technology, because what happens is that because there are so many options, especially through smartphones and the internet, I mean, it's that kind of thing when people say, well, there's like 180,000 religions on the planet, right? As if every one of those 180,000 were equally, you know, viable options. And so they become frozen before this possibilities. And this is replicated in relationships, it's replicated in searching for a job, etc. But in terms of spirituality, there's no way to get the depth that Brian was looking at in terms of, say, Catholic moral formation without creating some tradition in which you find yourself and you can go deep in. But the technology, I think, wows us with so many possibilities that we become unable to make choices. I convened a meeting of 12 thought leaders, pastors and thought leaders at Fuller Seminary during one of the grants, the SIA grant, and one of the words that came out was choice phobic. Probably the most harsh concern was that emerging adults are choice phobic.
Can you explain what you mean?
That there's so many choices they fear making any choice, because if you have two choices, you make one. You only have one that you regret, right? When you have 10,000, then there's 9,999 that could have been good, and I think that there's an amazing phobia, and that's another part of the Spotify religion. So the tinkering is, I'm never going to actually put my feet on anything, but I'm going to try to create something for right now. That's about all there is to it, or for this week. So it's another part of the connection, I think, with the project you're on.
So this has been really enjoyable and really interesting. To Rachel, I would say good experiment. I mean, good job, good for you for bringing in Joshua to conduct this experiment. You did a science experiment with your congregation. So it's fantastic, right? You learn things by experimentation. And something you just said, actually, just now echoed with me. You said that they're looking for depth anywhere, right? And you know, shallow things seem deep when there's no water around, right? If you find a puddle, you're like, oh, I found some depth. Because other than that, there's no water, right? And I think, I think you can see this showing up in a lot of spaces in the way people gravitate towards conspiracy theories or towards right-wing, what are the right-wing people? Right, alternative right type people, right? Also, you know, on the extreme other end of the spectrum, people are just looking for something to hold on to because it doesn't seem like there's something there. So even something really shallow seems deep. Greg, I really like your insight on influencers, and sometimes I feel like, wow, maybe I should be on Twitter, and then I think to myself, no, I shouldn't be on Twitter. but I think that what I should do is that if I see things that I think people are doing right, I should say this person's doing it right. I should at least, you know, go out and affirm people. Because although I'm not a voice, at least I'm not a big voice, at least I can, you know, do what little I can, because our culture is also very, very built on tearing people down. Whenever somebody makes a mistake, everyone tears them down all at once. But the idea of someone doing something right and getting approval for it and building them up based on that, I think is actually kind of a really important thing.
Josh, do you have any comments back on that?
Yeah, I think, wonderful insights all. Yeah, the 180,000 religions is interesting. I think we're going to teach philosophy of religion. Early on, I will say, for 90, sometimes I would say 95 to 98% of the people in the world follow one of two religions. There's Semitic monotheism, and there's Indo-European paganism. And if you look at the roots in terms of Hinduism, Buddhism, Norse religion, and Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and it's a different perspective. And then, well, where does the variety come from? And so, in some ways, it's a matter of perspective. In other ways, it's a matter of history. And you think about the unity of humanity in terms of this one ancient group in Africa. Linguistically, there's all kinds of stories to be told scientifically as they relate to religion. But I think the question of where do you fit in that? What are the most important things? Robert Bella used the term Sheilaism. That's the religion of America. Named after someone named Sheila, because she has this hodgepodge of views, and that's her religion, and it's nothing conventional. People aren't seeking to adhere to orthodoxy. But I think, there's a lot to think about there. With Rochelle, I think just, that I was thinking of the depth comment as well. How do you go for depth? Because I see that longing for depth, and with Brian, this question of technology and building up, and it is a very deconstructive culture, and you don't have a lot of building up. I think that creates a very, very poisonous dynamic, I think, and just, I think, fear too. Who wants to say anything if everyone's just going to tear them down? So I think, for me, I think a lot of the sort of existence in Christian theology, to focus on building up, to focus on focusing on what is pure and noble, and then separating from what tears down. There's resources for depth. I think it's for me, it's a challenge of how to translate them in our current context, which I know is also this is what we're all trying to do. So it's a very fun. This is a conversation I was hoping would happen. So it's exciting for me to create an occasion for this conversation. Was my hope for this fellowship, and to get as many people as we can be part of this conversation. So, okay, we care about this. What do we do now? And I realized like, I don't have the answers. I have my own experience, I have my own practice, but and we can bring them together. So hopefully get to the next step. So I see that happening.
So we have one more round of comments and then we'll open it up. So Brian, do you want to come back in?
I like the question of what can we do now, because we have to do something. I'm an ethicist, right? You have to do something. So, yeah, I'd like to think about what those next steps might be. Yeah, and also just increasing the scale of the impact, right? I spend, I work at Santa Clara University. I'm surrounded by companies. What's the question they're always asking? How do we scale up?
Scale up.
How do we scale up? So the question is, CTNS, has done a fantastic thing here. How do we scale up that voice?
Greg, what about?
I would say to Rochelle, I think what you've done with youth is really an important set of data in some ways. I think that Brian's comparing this to like a scientific experiment was really accurate. The fact that you reflected on your experience was really, it's very scientific in the best sense of the word. Or put another way, it's kind of the method of liberation theology, that it's reflection on praxis. And I think we could do a lot of, we could learn a lot if we talk to practitioners who are doing this work and begin to lift up some best practices that we could scale, I think, into other contexts. But we might learn a lot from the practitioners about how we can come up again with broader themes that can be taken to other places. So anyway, I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing.
Rochelle, do you have
Yeah, I think something that I was reflecting on from earlier is, I think what you brought up, Greg, of the voices that people have, or the voices that speak into people's lives, it really matters. And so, yeah, and just how can we be engaging with young people and being a positive influence, toward faith for them, I think. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, with these different, thinking about these different aspects that challenge us.
Okay, thank you all. Let's open it up. I'm going to suggest Pastor Andrew take the first shot because you're so great to have you here on the day before Holy Week, and you're the church pastor. So what's your take on all this?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the interesting themes that I was seeing across all four of your presentations was the role of human interaction and the role of relationship in what, in some ways might seem at first to be much more intellectual topics, the role of technology, the role of science, these different areas. But I think especially when you were talking, Greg, I was thinking about this role of, sometimes it's not even the data, it's not even the facts or it's going to move somebody. It is the relationship with them. And then you have to have these good facts, but without that, people are ignoring them. And that's kind of been my question. I mean, all of you have presented things that are very challenging to me. It's been I'd like to think about how to apply those, but then I was also thinking about, how do you get, an average person to actually engage with this question in a way that isn't dismissive, sometimes just giving answers or the academy or intellectual debates can actually be anti-depth. It's a way of avoiding depth. You talk about this topic instead of talking about what does this mean to you. So at least that's the question that I'm going to leave with and try to figure out. How do you take these remarkably good things that are being said and bring them into the lives of people so that the conversation can have depth and hopefully people can be changed.
Okay. Others?
Question. So it follows on what you're saying about using it in practice. How, and I guess this is for all of you because you've all worked with churches, how do you get the senior ministry of a church, I'm happy that you're here, who might have a more conservative vision. Even I belong to a pretty liberal Protestant community church that's not, it's probably more Presbyterian than anything, but we have a senior minister who feels like it's better to be really conservative with the kids because they're going to get liberal later anyway, so he feels like it's a balance. And from what I see in your work, it's like, no, you're gonna lose them, by being very conservative to the young people. This is what it is, Genesis says this, blah, blah, blah. You turn them off. So how do you, from a pragmatic standpoint, how do you get not just the senior minister, but you've got the Christian Education Board, and there's a lot of constituents, a lot of people who may or may not buy into this, absent a grant or something, or absent bringing you in. And we have all these resources of people like Bob comes and preaches at our church sometimes. But how do you actually make that happen and get buy-in from the kind of gatekeepers of the Christian education program? That's my question.
Any thoughts, Alan?
Yeah, I think something that I found helpful is starting with data that's accessible. So like the book You Lost Me is a very accessible book, and I think if you start with the question, do you care about the actual causes that result in people losing faith? Because there's the truth question, and then there's the practical question, and they tie together somewhere. But if the question is what causes youth or other people to leave the church, then you can look at, well, what causes them to stay in the church?
Yeah.
And then what sort of questions are they asking? And then finding the balance. I mean, it's interesting, Smith's work shows that longevity of faith is related to an interpretation or a hermeneutic that's more conservative but not fundamentalist.
Right.
And so, because it builds cognitive resilience. And so finding that balance. So these documents, these ancient documents do have something authoritative to say, and each tradition is going to find, well, what is that? Where do we part with this? And these are the real issues that divide churches too. And I think that's why there's a tendency just to ignore the bigger questions, because the churches don't really even know where they are theologically. But when the youth are trying to decide, why do I believe this ancient document? It has to say something that's different than what's out there for them to stay.
Yeah, and I think it can be what's the narrative? Is the narrative, well, they're going to do this, then they're going to leave the church, then they're all going to come back once they have kids. Like, and there's this narrative that they go out and then they come back. Like this big elliptical.
And that's where the emerging adult reality is so important.
Yeah.
Because they're not having kids till they're 30, right?
Yeah.
They're 35, and all of a sudden that standard narrative doesn't work
And then they
anymore.
never come back.
They're not coming back.
It's
A lot of them don't come
Yeah.
back.
Yeah, but if the narrative is, oh, they'll come back. It's like,
No.
this what you're saying is actually not really.
Well, I would add to that, I think every pastor I talk to is worried about the longevity of their church. I mean, given the phenomenon of the nuns, our churches are shrinking, right? All across the board, not just mainliners, Catholic, even evangelical churches are shrinking. And so I think we probably have to, if we want to convince people who are on the board or the senior leader, we have to convince them this is actually going to be positive for the church, right? I mean, I think that's what Joshua was talking about is really important, to say these are things that actually youth need to know about because they're going to stay in the church. They're going to be contributors, maybe not financially, but at some level, they're going to be people who are involved in the congregation. I was on the staff and very involved at First Pres Berkeley when I was a college student, and on the staff later. And one of the things that head of staff, Earl Palmer, used to say is if you get the 14-year-old to come to hear the sermon, she will bring her parents, right? And so I think part of keeping the youth engaged is that the parents will see something valuable about the church. But the way to present it, it seems to me, is to say this is actually going to make the church a more valuable community in terms of its longevity and sustainability. That question is the felt need for pastors.
Others?
In response to
Might
that,
say who you.
I'm sorry. My name is Stephanie Green, and I graduated from CDSP in 2000. I'm an Episcopal priest serving in Pleasant Hill in Children's and Family Ministry with a youth component because it's needed right now. And I'm also in, as I said to Bob earlier, in a perpetual PhD program in comparative literature at Downey Health. There was actually a wonderful sort of science and religion forum a couple of years ago at St. John's Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, and I remember there was an evangelical scientist, I think from Texas, who who I'm responding to this, you know, it matters for the church. I would say what happens in the church also matters for the world. So the distinction she made between sort of science and religion and how to bring them together, she said is, you know, scientists, we can tell you how something works. Now we need religious people in there to be in dialogue about how it's going to be used, right? So just in response to a couple of things that were being said, first, I'm along with you. Like right now, the issue that I'm finding in the church that I'm serving is that there are some youth mentors who have been doing the same form of Bible study for the past 25 years with the youth. And it's kind of, for me, rooted in the sort of free to be you and me, you know, 70s. Like, how do you feel about the text, or what does this say to you? Whereas my sense right now of the youth is that they want to be part of something bigger than themselves, right? And so, yes, we could say, well, we've always had a series of approaches to reading biblical text, and why are we only using one in this setting? But, you know, this is sort of a pedagogical matter of also not having arcs of learning that are woven into the year. But what I would like to ask about is not only, you know, do you sort of have to bring senior staff around and your Christian educators, but how do you actually instill curiosity in adults? All right, like we're all academics, or like we have some association with the academic world. But how do you spark intellectual curiosity with adults, and how do you enable them to feel confident in not knowing the right answer, right? Because the youth can see through these adults. They can see through that they are uncomfortable, right? So that would be one question. And then I was also just telling Bob, I was recounting that when I was in high school, and I will say that my lab partner in physics did go out to work for NASA. I did not. But I would write at the top of my physics exams PTL. And at some point my physics teacher, you know, was like, of course we were all about the equations and the formulas, and I said, what is PTL? You had to ask, praise the Lord. Okay, so it was like this thing, right? Because I would bring prayer to my test. And now in hearing you, I think, you know, I'm thinking about Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who said that the church acclimatizes us to peace and praise. And the other day, as I've been thinking about worship in Holy Week, I thought, you know what, actually, maybe that doesn't sound so interesting to people. Peace and praise. But this idea of creative mutual interaction, like, is that possibly a new way of thinking about peace? Right? About bringing together those things, reconciling things, making things whole. And is there a way in which bringing together, right, that physics exam and praise the Lord, is there a way in which our engagement of science, and I think you were alluding to this already, right at the end of your talk, is there a way in which our engagement with science can re-innovate our praise, right? Like, if we think about the ways that the views of the world in the Psalms give forth to praise, how can our new views of the world through science create new songs for us, right?
Let's have our
And I'll just stop
Let's
there.
have our panel.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful place for creativity and art. I think of songs in our context we've used, which I remember hearing them for the first time. You know, someone at a church who knew I was interested in science emailed me a link to a song. I think it's Hillsong United. It's the group that's sort of God of creation. They're at the start before the beginning of time. And yeah, you know it. And it's like it talks about. You know, and as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are formed. And talk about creatures evolving according to God's creation. And so it uses evolving, and then half the churches say, we're never singing that song. We're dumping all praise songs by Hillsong United. But then there's other churches saying, wow, this is a beautiful way to bring in the story of creation, the epic of the Big Bang and evolution into art. And then you know, introduce that to some youth in our church. And I thought, wow, I just love this song. And it's again a retreat as our theme song for the retreat, and just sort of and it's meaningful. It's okay, we've just found a song that we can sing that's now meaningful. And of course, you have a couple adults. I don't like that they mention evolution in that song, right? You know, and you're going to have those. But when the core is moving in one direction, I think. For me, that's the important part. Is when you create this core through formation, through education, through worship, and especially when your staff is united, musician. And so the worship director says, yes, that's great, let's use that song. And then everyone else, and the senior pastor's on board, and the youth director's on board, and then, but I think getting everyone on board might be a challenge, and might have a lot of, it's, might be some difficult conversations, and not everyone starts on the same page, but that's, I think that's, and in my experience, that's how we've found a way forward, and just always thinking, of different ways. The other day I was writing someone, adopting a psalm with more contemporary language with science, from the pit, and thinking about black holes and things like this, and it's just, and this person responded by saying, that's a beautiful song. I didn't tell her it was a song, because she was in a really low place, and so there's this, and she loves science, so it's become, the psalm takes on a meaning when you translate it into concepts that I never thought about a black hole. You can't get out of it. There's no light. I mean, and beyond the event horizon, and I feel alone and spaghettified in this whole. But it's like, wow, that's who's the artist of that? I'm like, David, right, or whoever wrote Psalm 88. But that's the. It has an impact. It takes a lot of creativity.
Other comments?
Yeah.
One thing I would say is that first of all, I'm from Pleasant Hill also, so so maybe we should talk about this. So I've been sitting here listening to Joshua and Rochelle and Greg, I'm thinking to myself, I think I need to go to the pastor of my church and talk about this. Because my daughter goes to middle school, and she's already getting hit by this, why do you believe in God, why do you believe in God, why do you believe in God? And I think to myself, every one of those kids lost, if they never come back again, then there's not going to be a church in the future. So we're kind of in a dire position right here, and it's sink or swim. So we need to do something. And by the way, it was another student who was really into science who was pushing my daughter on this. And I said, oh, don't worry about that. Just look at this book. And she flipped through this book on it was like beginning apologetics or something like really basic. And I got it like 20 years ago. And she looked at it for like 10 minutes. She's like, all right. And stuck it back on the shelf. And she came back, or a few weeks later, I was like, so did you talk to that boy who was bothering you about that? And she's like, yeah, I started talking to him, and he said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Because she had come up with something that had made him no longer interested in talking about the subject. The purpose of the subject was to addle her, and the idea of her having a response just stopped it.
So, yes, please, sir.
Yes, I have a question to the panel, to Michelle and Joshua specific. It has been talking much around faith and science, but I wonder, didn't the youth concerned about the very big climate problem that is around the world? In Europe, it's a very big movement just now about this Greta Thunberg, but I haven't heard so much about it here in US and in Berkeley. So I just wonder, did the youth think about it or talk about it in the relation to the Bible and what the Bible says about the environment and the earth? Just only have one earth. There's no second.
Sure, yeah, definitely, there you are. It's a big topic of conversation for a lot of the youth, and I think they seem to not be very hopeful about kind of like, the just state of kind of how our leaders are dealing with climate and things like that. So it's a struggle because, when I usually talk with them about it, I'll just, be like, there's still hope, but I think for them, they really want to talk through it more and just especially because they can't vote. They're just like, you know, we can't vote, but our leaders are, you know, making decisions that are going to affect us for life. So, but I think they do have an understanding that God cares about what we do with the earth He's given us. They certainly believe that. And yeah, so I think it'd be good to try to even talk about it more with them, I think, and what is the hope. Yeah.
I gotta say, I go to a different church, First Congregational Church, Berkeley, right down here. And we have a very active called Green Team, which has been really concerned about climate change in the church. We had a major church fire 2.5 years ago. It was a real tragedy. But it also is an opportunity to rebuild the church in a much more climate-friendly way. And so we're going to go after a multi-million-dollar loan to be very conscious about our impact and to try to be a light in the community, saying this is how you actually can rebuild a church. So that it's both a sanctuary and something that's incredibly committed to environmental impact. And we also 2 weeks ago had a wonderful forum on the very issue, and the way in which it's the first world that's caused the problems, the third world is going to suffer. So it's not only, it's not only the concern for the least empowered, that's key to Christian response to climate change, but even for the most least empowered, which are the animal species that will suffer and have no voice whatsoever. So we're called both to the least of our species and to the least of other species who suffer from us. So it's a huge issue for us. Another comment? Sandy, you want to?
Or just on this topic, the national leadership of all the churches should take that position.
Yeah, that's been.
And very loudly. Can I ask a question? I was very blown away by what Brian, the whole topic of technology. And Greg, at one point, mentioned the name Jonathan Haidt. And you have to go to New York and be a speaker. I'm talking now to Brian. Jonathan Haidt has got an organization around the whole country of universities. And I'm going to be going to this thing in New York. But it's exactly on the kind of thing that he would love to have your mission, the technology, would be very relevant to bring to the college, to bring your approach. Or let me just ask it as a question. Have you thought about how do you magnify, how do you take what you've told us, how do you multiply that by 1,000?
Exactly, I mean, that's the scale-up question, yeah. So that's something that we at the Marco Center have been thinking about for a while, because we're a 30-year-old institution, and yet people still have not heard of us, and we're like, why don't people know about us? And so we're thinking about that as an institution, and I'm also thinking about it as an individual, right? If I have something that I think is worth saying, then how do I actually get the message out? So I don't have a comprehensive plan.
Well, Jonathan Haidt, you should, if you can possibly go to New York, it'll be in June, and give your talk there, because that gets to lots of universities around the country.
Okay.
We can talk.
Yeah, let's talk more.
Can I add one thing to the last comment? Is that right, Bob? I think one of the things that we're hearing from, I think your very first point, Joshua, is to listen to the youth. And I've been really thinking about this. What are the trending topics that I didn't learn 30 years ago when I started doing this work? Climate change is huge. Race is huge. That's a sleeper that we're not taking on. AI can ask questions like what is the soul that are much more approachable. Transhumanism, and I think big data is another new one. So I would just say the youth are going to change the topics of this conversation. And if we want to speak to the youth, we do need to listen to them and actually think of their topics. The greatest hope for climate change is if you look at the data, the youth believe that this is anthropogenic climate change, right? They're not needing to be convinced of this. It's honestly one party and one group of political association that is against climate change in the whole industrial world, right? So that will change. I think time will change that, you know.
We have time for one or two more comments, because I see that the refreshments are here. Laura?
Yeah, I'm Laura Kutzona, I'm Greg's wife. I'm always encouraged on this topic ever since Greg's been dabbling in it, and I keep telling him we gotta write a book, particularly for youth, younger youth. Our children didn't have a good experience in the church in relationship to youth ministry in general. Maybe that's because they're the pastor's kids, but this was the topic I felt at the end of the day was where they really lost out. And thank goodness that we had these conversations at the dinner table, and they're both going into the sciences, probably in great part as a result, and still pray and have some form of a relationship with God. What interests me, Michelle, what you were talking about, just got my brain thinking was, okay, so what you guys are doing is, you know, again, 1% of youth groups are doing, having any conversations about science. So just why don't you go on and be the poster child for also the other part of that, which is they don't want to just talk about it. They actually want to experiment, experience, and share out. I think one of the dangers of technology is slacktivism, and the idea that this is how we are activists. I work as an advocate for the homeless, and we need people who do a lot more than this, because this is useless as advice for activism. And the youth, I think, get that. I think that's a way that they form community, is that they do side-by-side work on behalf of something that they care about. I think it's the old form of the mission trip, but it's really about these scientific/social issues that matter to them. I think if they're learning something that means something to them, they may be interested in inviting their friends to that. It's a form of evangelism, if you will, but with a new vernacular. And I think I could so see you guys, you've been such at the front of this, really taking it up, and maybe you have, and I'd be curious to hear what has come, like where do they want to go next with what they're experiencing in the comfort of the church? What do they want to do with it? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we found is when we let the youth lead in terms of interests, then their friends show up.
Yep.
And because they're the topics like race, they're talking about race, and then, okay, well, there's this whole history, and there's lots of parts of the history they've never heard too. Darwin grew up in an abolitionist context, and this was his scientific motivation. Darwin's sacred cause, right? And so there's this whole world of interesting stuff out there that revolutionizes the way they think about reality, and then you're saying something interesting, and then friends show up, and we've had experiences with this. I actually learned something worthwhile. It wasn't completely boring like I thought it would be, and pointless. So, and I think, yeah, the youth interest and the environment is it's a given. I think so. If you're not on board with this, that's going to be another thing that's going to disconnect you from youth. So, but yeah, do you have any thoughts, Michelle?
Yeah, I just had a thought. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I mean, I just see like with one of the youth in our group who has been coming since she was a 6th grader, but she's not a Christian, but she's very active in our community. Like she's on the green team I think at Berkeley High. I mean, I think it's called Green Team.
Sure.
And yeah, so it is a really, important thing to think about what are the areas that they're serving in, and how can we, like I want to do that better. I mean, I've never really, served with her in that way, but I like that you brought that up, and, kind of going
Very
out and doing the
service-minded.
things. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We have time for one last comment. You've been waiting, please, go ahead.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yes, please.
There was another one too, but I have an extremely simple idea how to start spreading this message that we heard, the technology paper. And that's just that we will all be equipped with each of us a copy of what you read. Because that was very precise, very clear, very nice, very organized. A, B, C, I mean everything. And if we start internalizing this and pray about each issue, fantastic things will happen. That's my
That was scalable right there. Thank you.
Yeah, the good news is we are going to publish the responses.
Aha,
Now, if you want a copy sooner, just email me
okay.
and I'll get you a copy sooner, but we are going to publish them, so
Okay.
good
Great.
thought. Okay, I think I'm going to suggest we close with a round of applause from all. Refreshments, one quick comment. In 2 weeks, actually 10 days, we have one more public forum, and it's on CRISPR. And ethics and patients. We have an expert from UC Berkeley on CRISPR to come here. So Wednesday, 24th, 7 o'clock, right here, same room. Hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Yeah.